Hello there, friend. Welcome back. It is great to be with you, and I hope you're ready for story time because I am going to share a story today that is so special to me. And I was reminded about it this morning, actually, when I was at an appointment and I was talking with someone, and we got to talking, and it came up, and I had this aha moment where I realized what a special week this was. And I hadn't thought about it until this person and I had a conversation. So I want to share that with you today on the podcast. So listen in if you're driving, if you're walking, whatever, you're going to get a little story time today on the Doing What Matters podcast. So let's get started. So before I dive into the story that I want to share with you that has such a special place in my heart, I want to encourage you to go to thereallifeprocess.com/time and download this free resource. And it'll make more sense as I share this story today, why I think it's important for you to have this free resource about time. But just go download it, thereallifeprocess.com. Remember, we spell real life with one L, /time, and download this free resource. It's going to be an outline of how I describe living out your best real life on a day-to-day basis. What are the kind of time blocks and ways that we talk about time? And it'll give you some worksheets to work around that. So download that free resource. That's your first action step that I'm going to ask you to do. And if you're driving or walking, whatever, just come back and go to the show notes. You can find that link there, but it's pretty easy to remember, the real life process /time. So let me dive into the story with you. So I'm at this appointment today, and this conversation that I begin to have came up about genetics and, the fact that I have gray hair. And if you watch the podcast on YouTube, you'll see that I have this gray full head of hair that my mother has and my grandmother has. And this person said to me, "Oh, your daughter Anneke will probably have gray hair too." And I said, "Actually, she won't. Or she might, but she probably won't, because our daughter Anneke is adopted. Just like our son, Eric, that you've often heard me talk about here on the podcast. And then I talk about Eric's story in the book that I wrote, Do What Matters. And so you've heard a lot about our son, Eric. But as I was sharing with her that, no, our daughter, Anneke, probably would not have gray hair, it dawned on me that this past week now that we've experienced, where we celebrated Valentine's Day, that it would have been 25 years ago that we adopted our daughter Anneke from the country of Romania. She was actually about 26 and a half months old when we brought her home, so a little over 2. She's 27 years old now, but it was 25 years ago, last week on February 14th, when we saw our beautiful daughter, Anneke, for the very first time. And I just want to share a little bit of a story with you about that journey. We'll get to know each other a little bit better here today on this podcast, because after I left that appointment, I thought, wow, 25 years ago. Now, I don't know if you can think back 25 years ago. You may not have even been on the planet for 25 years, or you may have been on for 3 times that amount. I don't know. But in many, many ways, and I was sharing this with my daughter when I asked her permission to do this podcast, I always try to ask permission from her or my husband or anyone that I might talk about personally on the podcast or write about in a book or something like that. And she said, "Sure, Mom, that's fine." She's used to me by now. But when you think back 25 years. I don't know if you ever have things that you feel like, gosh, that just feels like it was just yesterday. Anneke actually joked with me and said, the expiration return date has expired. And that's her wit and her humor. And I love her so much for that. But I'll never forget that trip and that day. For one thing, it was the first time that my husband and I, either one, had been out of the country. And I remember making the decision even, and how much we prayed and thought about adopting again. And our son Eric was in the 5th grade at the time, and I so longed to have a daughter. I didn't want our son to be an only child, and I wanted more children, and we were not able to have children. We struggled with infertility, and so we decided and made the decision together that we would pursue adoption. Now, remember, this was in the late 90s. Things were very, very different, and we decided to do international adoption. And through some coincidences, which aren't really coincidences, they're God moments, there was a family that lived in our small little town that had done a lot of mission work in the country of Romania. And I reached out to her. She had a son in our son Eric's class. And I reached out to her and asked her if she knew of any programs through the country of Romania. And she did. And long story short, she connected us with an organization that was out of St. Louis, Missouri at the time. And we began the process of international adoption through the country of Romania. And it actually happened very quickly. And if you've listened to the podcast for very long, you know that if I set my mind to it, my personality, I didn't know anything about personality types. I wasn't doing anything remotely like the work that I'm doing now back then. But I often think about my pursuit of adopting both of our children, and that out of the two of us, my husband and I, that I am the driving personality that was determined to make the adoptions happen. And the same thing happened in Anneke's process. And long story short, we got everything done and turned in fairly quickly, got our home studies done, got everything pushed through, did all the paperwork, mounds and mounds of paperwork that we needed to do. And in August of that year, it would have been August of 1998, we received a beautiful video, VHS video. I still have it to this day. And I remember waiting at the door for it to be delivered and waiting on the UPS man and anticipating it coming. I knew from the agency that it was coming, and running into my living room and putting it in the machine and watching this beautiful little blonde 2-year-old girl running around the home that she was staying in there in Bucharest, Romania, with a little yellow dress on. And she was absolutely beautiful, and she was ours. And that began the journey from August until Valentine's Day of 1999. So, 4 or 5 months that we knew that our daughter Anneke was in Romania and that we were going to bring her home. And about every 3 to 4 weeks, we would get a video and an update anytime that another family traveled there to bring home and one of their children that they were adopting. They would send and take video, and we did the same when we met and got Anneke and brought her home. And so on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1999, we saw our daughter for the very first time. And we have such beautiful pictures of bonding with her, and mostly, which was an amazing thing to witness, her bonding with our son, Eric, who was 10 years older than her. He was in fifth grade. And one of the best decisions we ever made was to take Eric with us on that trip because she bonded so quickly with Eric. I remember driving away, which was very hard for her because she had moved a few times as she was in kind of a foster care type system. And she had moved a couple times, and she was very attached to the young girls that were taking care of her, as she would be. I always often get the question, was she speaking Romanian? Well, she was just a little over 2, so she wasn't speaking a lot of anything, but she was used to hearing the Romanian language. And of course, we did not speak Romanian. So as we got into the car and drove away, I remember that she would sit on Eric's lap because for some reason she bonded with him. And they just had a beautiful relationship. We stayed in the country for 4 or 5 days, and Dale went and did paperwork here, there, and yonder, my husband Dale, and he would have to go to the embassy and get paperwork and go to different places. And Eric and I and Anneke would stay in the hotel room, and he would push her up and down the hall in the stroller. We had nowhere to go. We have so many great memories from that trip, bringing her home on the long flight, and then in the middle of the night, kind of getting home finally to our home, and her running into our house. And she was just beautiful and precious. I couldn't take my eyes off of her. She actually looked like a little Precious Moments figurine, if you remember those from back in the day. Just these beautiful, beautiful eyes. And I ended up decorating her room in Precious Moments dolls and painting stencils on her walls and all the things. And she ran into her room and she played with the little kitchen set that I had for her. And we, of course, had been up for hours at that point. And it's just a beautiful memory and moment from 25 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. And over the years, as many adoptive parents, February 14th to us is not Valentine's Day anymore. It's her gotcha day. It's the day that we saw her for the first time. And she's now 27 years old. She's lived a lot of life in those 27 years. And as any child does that is adopted, she's been curious and wondered about her story. And the agency that we went through was amazing and had a lot of records and a lot of things that they had given us, and paperwork and different things. And when Anneke was about a freshman in high school, she became very curious just about her heritage and her adoption story and many things. And to be honest, at that point in time, we were also really, really struggling with Eric. Things had begun to get pretty intense around his addiction and behaviors. And one night I came home at the time I was serving on staff as a pastor. And I came home from church on a Wednesday night, and Anneke was sitting there on the couch. And Facebook and all the things were still, I don't want to say new, but, still newer, I guess I would say. And I came home and Anneke pulled up a picture and showed it to me and said, "Mom, I think I've connected with my sister in Romania." And I just stopped dead in my tracks. And I'm like, "What?" And she showed me a picture and I'm like, wow. And come to find out, she had been searching. She knew last names and she knew names. And she had actually ended up connecting with two of her siblings that lived in Romania over Facebook. So, as much as we can bash Facebook, there are beautiful things that happen in connection in that social media world. And her father came in later, dad came in later that evening, and she showed him the picture. And he thought it was actually a picture of her because they looked so much alike. And we just stayed curious. And I kind of, as a parent, really at that point, followed her lead because I don't know why, but God really told me this is her story and this is hers to discover and to figure out what she wants to do with it. But it wasn't long before, that was in the fall, and it wasn't long until she was asking if there was any way that we could go to Romania and meet her family. And I won't go into all the details of how that happened and how we got that to happen, but we did. We ended up connecting with a wonderful missionary who lived in Romania that we connected with through a friend of a friend and all of that. And we ended up traveling to Romania in the summer of that year. I believe, if I'm correct, it was 2012, but 2011, 2012, that we traveled to Romania. Anneke was between her freshman and sophomore year in high school, and myself and Anneke and a very good friend of mine, Erica Vinson, that you've heard me talk about here on the podcast and actually works for us and has been a guest here many times, ended up traveling to Romania that summer. My husband, life on the farm is very busy in the summertime, and he was not able to go. And sometimes when I look back on this story, that's the one maybe regret that I have, is that Dale wasn't a part of that trip. But we didn't even know for sure when we went that we would be meeting her family. We were kind of taking a risk because, again, we were using social media to communicate back and forth. It didn't have the translation feature. We had to put everything through Google Translator. I mean, it seems like a lifetime ago in some ways that some of our technology worked that way, but it did. And so, long story short, we ended up getting into the country, ended up making a phone call between our missionary friend who spoke Romanian and Anneke's brother. And I think that was a moment I'll never forget, sitting there and listening to her translate back and forth from telling what her brother was saying on the phone and our friend translating that to Anneke, and finding out that Anneke's birth mother wanted to meet her as well. We thought, we didn't know the whole story. We didn't know all the details, but of where her birth mother even was. We had just been communicating mostly with her oldest brother. And I remember watching Anneke in that moment at 15 years old sit at the table and me saying to her, Anneke, do you want to meet your birth mother? And I often say I watched my daughter grow into an adult in that moment, because she was brave and she was decisive. And she said, yes, I do. Because I said, we may never be back again. I don't know. But this is your decision. And I felt that shift so much right then in that moment. And maybe you've had that experience with your own children of, this is a decisive moment. And here's the shift that I saw. And so we traveled by train across the country from one side of Romania over by Budapest, across the small country of Romania to Bucharest. Just a crazy, amazing trip. There's so many details I could tell you about this story, but that's not necessary for right now. But we traveled by train. we ended up meeting her birth mother, her 3 siblings, and experience a homecoming that I have never, it was one of the most special times in my life. And we visited their home. We had hired a translator to spend time with us and translate for us. And we went to their home. We visited with them. We spent about 3 or 4 days, and it was absolutely beautiful. And one of the hardest moments I've ever had in my life is when we left. And we walked away from this beautiful family of aunts and uncles and grandparents and a birth mother and siblings, and we said goodbye. And again, one of the bravest, most courageous things I've ever seen my daughter do. And it was hard. It was difficult. It was hard for me, and yet I had so much love and appreciation for this family that was now connected to ours. Always had been since the day we had adopted Anneke, but now even more so. And that was back in 2012. And over the years, Anneke has stayed connected and mostly through, again, social media, the Facebook platform. And we have watched her siblings grow up. Anneke was the youngest of the 4 of them, and we've seen them grow up. We've seen them married. We've seen them have children, as my daughter has done as well. And so when she married a few years ago, I knew it was heavy on her heart about her family in Romania. And we weren't sure exactly what to do about that, but a year later, after Anneke and her husband were married, they decided, and they saved up money and decided to make a trip back to Romania. And it was beautiful. The 2 of them went back together and actually spent several days in Romania reconnecting with Anneke's family, and also then spending some time honeymooning in Greece, and just had an absolutely beautiful trip. And they are grown now as well and have siblings. She got to see her birth mother again. And just to see the change even in the country in the last 10 years, and the connection and the thread in her story of staying connected to the people that matter. And then a year later, Anneke became a mother to our beautiful little grandson. Her and her husband, our grandson is now 8 months old, little Wesley, and he is absolutely beautiful. And I have watched my daughter become the most beautiful young woman who is courageous and smart and witty and brave. I have watched her navigate this story of adoption in just some beautiful ways, and do the hard work of even the grief and loss of her brother Eric when she was at the beginning of her college years and was living away from us, and just, dealing with the grief and loss of a family member. They were 10 years apart, but they were very, very close in their younger years. And, navigating that story with her of doing hard things, and the honesty that we had to have with her around her brother's addiction. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy for her. It wasn't easy for us. And yet that she worked hard with the relationship she had with us as her parents. And we worked hard with that. We just sure didn't do it perfect. And maybe you can think about that in your story of, relationships are hard and you have to work at them. But I am so proud of her. I'm so proud of the mother that she is. I'm so proud that she's my daughter. I am so blessed by her in my life. My husband and I are so blessed that her and her husband are a part of our family farm operation, that Anneke will someday manage the farm for us if things continue that the way that they are, and that she works in my business as well and has a part on our team. It's just a blessing. And when I was having that conversation this morning with my friend, it just all came to me of how hard we have worked at the relationships that we have in our family, and how much that we value open and honest communication. Whether, Anneke's story, just like Eric's, with both of my children, have been very, very different, but they've had some really, really hard stories within them. And Anneke has navigated those well, but we have set up boundaries and relationships and communication that is open and honest and hard sometimes, but yet so necessary. And when I, as I kind of wrap this up, what I want you to hear, what I want you to take away is, when I ask that question so many times, what matters to you? If I was to ask you that right now, what matters to you? Most of us never say things like, oh, it's my career. If I get down to the nitty gritty, or, oh, it's the house I live in, or the car that I drive, or how much money I have. Most people will say, it is my family. It is those closest relationships, family, friends, the inner circles that we have, that we would say matter to us the most. So I would ask you, where are they at on your calendar? Because I know for me, that is what I had to learn, was to make the time for the people that mattered. So when I talk about living in a rule of life, living in a life management process, when I talk about time, which is something we talk about often, is how do we live that out in our everyday, ordinary life? And when I talk about time, one of my biggest learnings had to be, as a recovering workaholic, had to be, where are you making time for the people that matter? As I think about this story, and I think about, what if I would have said, Anneke, sorry, we're not going to make time for the trip to Romania. We're not going to make time for you to go back and make that connection. I didn't know what I know then, but I knew enough to say, this matters so much to my daughter and to her story. And maybe as I reflect, even saying that out loud, maybe that was the beginning of a turning point for me back 10 or 12 years ago, when I really was starting to say, I got to do this different. Because it was just a few years later that I resigned from my position and began some really hard work of working in my own life. So maybe that was a catalyst to it, was that trip that I knew in my gut that I had to say yes to. So I share that with you to say, think about time. Think about where people are showing up on your calendar, the people that really matter. It's not wrong to put them there first. Actually, I think it's the right thing to do. Get them there first, and then fill in the rest of the things that sometimes feel like the most urgent, but they're definitely not the most important. So I am so proud of who my daughter is. I'm so proud of what she's taught me so much and invited me to so many good things. And every Valentine's Day is a special one because of her. But 25 years ago, wow, just to celebrate that moment, I needed to do it. I needed to take the pause. So thank you, friend, for listening to this story, for doing this story with me. And This is how I do life. I love to do life with friends in community. If you're not a part of our circle, we'd love for you to be. You can go to thereallifeprocess.com/join. Come on over. Let's have more conversation. Come into our little online community and be a part. We invite you there. And don't forget about the download that I have that might help you to look at your week, to look at time, to see the way that I talk about time. You can also read about it in the book, Do What Matters. And so we'll have those links to everything in the show notes. But thank you for indulging me just a bit on this episode to share the story, a little bit of my daughter, her courageousness, her bravery, her wit, her humor. It was a moment that mattered today. So I encourage you to remember that every ordinary day has an extraordinary moment. You just have to look for them. Have a great week, friend. I'll see you next week on the Doing What Matters podcast.